Jimmy Cliff was told by a recording studio worker in England, "This won't work. Waste of time music." What happened months later was unbelievable. It was September 14th, 1972, at Island Records' Basing Street Studios in London, where Jimmy Cliff had traveled from Jamaica to record what he hoped would be his breakthrough album for international audiences. The studio was one of the most prestigious recording facilities in England, known for working with major rock and pop acts. But reggae music was still largely unknown and misunderstood by most of the British music industry. Jimmy had been invited to London by Chris Blackwell, the founder of Island Records, who believed that reggae consciousness could find audiences beyond the Caribbean if presented with proper production values and international marketing support. But not everyone at the label shared Blackwell's vision. And Jimmy was about to encounter the kind of cultural prejudice and musical ignorance that would test his faith in his artistic mission. The recording session was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m., with Jimmy planning to lay down basic tracks for songs that would later become some of reggae's most beloved classics. He had spent months preparing for this opportunity, writing new material and arranging existing psalms in ways that he hoped would communicate reggae consciousness to audiences who had never been exposed to Caribbean spiritual and social perspectives. When Jimmy arrived at Basing Street Studios, carrying his guitar and a notebook filled with song lyrics about consciousness-raising themes, social justice, and spiritual awakening, he was greeted by the studio's chief engineer, a man named Gerald Pemberton, who had worked with several successful British rock bands, but had never recorded reggae music or worked with Caribbean artists. Pemberton was in his mid-40s, a technically skilled engineer who took pride in his ability to capture the sound of electric guitars, rock drums, and the kind of polished production that characterized successful British pop music of the early 1970s. But he had little understanding of reggae's spiritual purpose or the cultural significance of the consciousness-raising messages that Jimmy was hoping to communicate. As Jimmy set up his equipment and began explaining his vision for the recording session, Pemberton's reaction made it immediately clear that he viewed reggae music as primitive, uncommercial, and unlikely to succeed with sophisticated audiences who expected high production values and familiar musical structures. "I've heard some of this Caribbean music before," Pemberton said dismissively, as Jimmy played a few chord progressions that demonstrated reggae's distinctive rhythmic approach. "This won't work for British audiences. It's too simple, too repetitive, and frankly sounds like amateur music that won't compete with real professional recording artists." Jimmy was stunned by this assessment, understanding that Pemberton was judging reggae music without any comprehension of its spiritual depth, social purpose, or the sophisticated consciousness-raising concepts that made it meaningful to audiences who understood its cultural context and consciousness-raising mission. "The rhythms are all wrong for radio play," Pemberton continued, adjusting his mixing board controls with obvious frustration. "This reggae thing is just a waste of time music that will never find audiences outside of small Caribbean communities that don't buy enough records to justify professional recording expenses." These words hit Jimmy like a physical blow, representing exactly the kind of cultural ignorance and musical prejudice that had prevented reggae consciousness from reaching international audiences who might benefit from its spiritual and social messages. Pemberton's dismissal wasn't just about music. It was about the value of Caribbean culture and the assumption that consciousness-raising art couldn't compete with commercial entertainment. But instead of arguing with Pemberton or allowing his negative attitude to derail the recording session, Jimmy made a decision that would prove his spiritual maturity and unwavering commitment to his artistic mission, regardless of the skepticism he encountered from people who couldn't understand reggae's deeper purposes. "I respect your technical expertise," Jimmy replied calmly, his voice carrying the kind of spiritual strength that characterized his approach to all challenges. "But this music serves purposes that go beyond commercial success or fitting into existing radio formats. I'm here to record consciousness-raising music that speaks to people's spiritual needs and social awareness. Jimmy continued setting up his equipment and preparing for the recording session, demonstrating the kind of professional focus and spiritual determination that would eventually prove Pemberton completely wrong about reggae's commercial and artistic potential. The recording session proceeded despite Pemberton's obvious lack of enthusiasm, with Jimmy laying down tracks for songs including Many Rivers to Cross, You Can Get It If You Really Want, and The Harder They Come, compositions that would later become reggae classics and prove that consciousness-raising music could achieve both artistic significance and commercial success when presented with authentic conviction. Throughout the session, Pemberton made no effort to understand or accommodate reggae's unique musical characteristics, treating Jimmy's music as if it were inferior rock music rather than a completely different artistic tradition that required different production approaches and cultural sensitivity. These songs all sound the same, Pemberton complained as Jimmy worked through multiple takes of Many Rivers to Cross, trying to capture the spiritual emotion and consciousness-raising power that made the song meaningful. There's no variety, no hooks, nothing that would make radio programmers interested in playing this repetitive Caribbean music. Jimmy completed the recording session despite Pemberton's negativity, producing rough demos of songs that carried the authentic spiritual power and consciousness-raising messages that would eventually touch millions of hearts worldwide. But as he packed up his equipment and prepared to leave Basing Street Studios, Jimmy had no way of knowing that his encounter with Gerald Pemberton would become one of the most ironic stories in music industry history. Months passed after Jimmy's dismissed recording session, during which time his album, The Harder They Come, was released internationally and began achieving success that surprised everyone except Jimmy himself and a few visionary music industry professionals who understood reggae's spiritual and commercial potential. The album started gaining airplay on progressive radio stations that were willing to expose their audiences to music that challenged conventional commercial formulas. And soon reggae consciousness was finding audiences who had never heard Caribbean music, but immediately connected with its spiritual messages and social awareness themes. Many Rivers to Cross became an international hit that reached the top 10 in multiple countries, proving that consciousness-raising music could achieve mainstream success when audiences were given opportunities to experience authentic spiritual expression rather than manufactured entertainment products. The song's success was particularly remarkable because it defied every assumption that Pemberton had made about commercial viability. Radio programmers who initially hesitated to play repetitive Caribbean music found themselves responding to overwhelming listener demand for the song that was providing spiritual comfort and inspiration to audiences worldwide. You Can Get It If You Really Want became an anthem for people facing challenges and seeking motivation through consciousness-raising music that spoke directly to their struggles and aspirations. The song's message of persistence and spiritual determination resonated with audiences who were dealing with personal, social, and economic difficulties that required exactly the kind of consciousness-raising perspective that Jimmy's music provided. The Harder They Come established Jimmy as reggae's international ambassador, while proving that consciousness-raising music could address social justice themes without alienating mainstream audiences who were ready for art that challenged superficial entertainment with authentic spiritual and political content. Meanwhile, Gerald Pemberton remained completely unaware of the success that Jimmy's Waste of Time music was achieving in international markets, continuing his work at Basing Street Studios and making the same kinds of dismissive judgments about other artists whose music didn't fit his narrow understanding of commercial viability. The irony of Pemberton's situation became apparent 6 months after Jimmy's recording session, when Chris Blackwell called a staff meeting at Island Records to discuss the label's most successful recent releases and congratulate everyone involved in the breakthrough success of reggae music in international markets. Our biggest success story this year has been Jimmy Cliff's album, The Harder They Come. Blackwell announced to the assembled staff members, including Gerald Pemberton, who was attending as the studio's representative. The album has exceeded all our sales projections and is introducing reggae consciousness to audiences worldwide who are hungry for authentic spiritual music. Blackwell continued with specific sales figures and radio airplay statistics that demonstrated the massive success of the album that Pemberton had dismissed as waste-of-time music just months earlier. The songs that Pemberton had criticized as too simple and too repetitive were being praised by music critics as revolutionary artistic expressions that combined spiritual depth with irresistible musical appeal. The sales figures were staggering, even by Island Records standards for successful releases. The Harder They Come had sold over 500,000 copies in its first 6 months, with particularly strong performance in markets that traditionally showed little interest in Caribbean music or consciousness-raising themes. International music critics were describing the album as a watershed moment in popular music, with Rolling Stone magazine calling it the most important musical breakthrough since Bob Dylan introduced folk protest music to rock audiences. The Guardian praised Jimmy's ability to communicate universal spiritual truths through distinctively Caribbean musical language that transcends cultural boundaries. Radio stations across Europe and North America were reporting that Many Rivers to Cross was generating more listener requests than any song they had played in years, with audiences describing the song as providing spiritual comfort during difficult times and inspiring hope for people facing seemingly impossible challenges. As Blackwell spoke about the international impact of Jimmy's music and Island Records' plans to sign additional reggae artists based on the success of The Harder They Come, Pemberton sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence, realizing that his assessment of Jimmy's music had been not just wrong, but spectacularly ignorant. The album's success was also leading to unexpected opportunities that demonstrated reggae's growing cultural influence. Major Hollywood producers were expressing interest in featuring Jimmy's music in films, understanding that consciousness-raising themes could enhance movie soundtracks with authentic spiritual depth that audiences were seeking. Music schools were beginning to offer courses in reggae music production and Caribbean cultural studies, recognizing that Jimmy's success had proven the commercial and artistic viability of musical traditions that had previously been marginalized by educational institutions focused on European and American musical forms. Many Rivers to Cross was being covered by major rock and pop artists who recognized its emotional power and universal spiritual themes, while You Can Get It If You Really Want had become an anthem for civil rights movements and social justice organizations that found in Jimmy's music the kind of consciousness-raising inspiration they needed for their activism. But the most devastating moment for Pemberton came when Blackwell played audio clips from recent interviews with major music industry figures who were praising Jimmy's album and specifically citing the recording quality and production values that had been achieved during the Basing Street Studios sessions. "The production on Many Rivers to Cross is perfect," said a quote from Rolling Stone magazine that Blackwell read aloud. "The recording captures both the intimate spiritual emotion and the universal consciousness-raising power that makes Jimmy Cliff's music so compelling to audiences worldwide." Another review from Melody Maker praised the sophisticated production techniques that allowed Jimmy's spiritual messages to reach listeners with maximum emotional impact while maintaining the authentic Caribbean cultural elements that give reggae music its unique consciousness-raising power. Pemberton realized with growing horror that these critics were praising exactly the recording session that he had dismissed as unprofessional and uncommercial, and that his negative attitude had been completely wrong about music that was now being hailed as revolutionary artistic achievement. The final irony came when Blackwell announced that Island Records was planning to expand their reggae recording program and wanted to bring Jimmy back to Basing Street Studios for his next album, specifically requesting the same engineering team that had worked on the successful Harder They Come sessions. "Gerald, since you engineered Jimmy's breakthrough album, we want you to handle his next recording project," Blackwell said directly to Pemberton, who was now facing the prospect of working again with the artist whose music he had so thoroughly dismissed and underestimated. Pemberton had no choice but to accept the assignment, understanding that admitting his previous negative attitude toward Jimmy's music would expose his professional judgment as inadequate and potentially damage his reputation within the Island Records organization that was now committed to reggae as a major artistic and commercial priority. When Jimmy returned to Basing Street Studios for his second recording session 3 months later, the atmosphere was completely different from their previous encounter. Pemberton approached the session with obvious humility and respect, understanding that he was now working with an internationally successful artist whose waste of time music had proven more commercially and artistically significant than many of the rock and pop recordings he had previously considered superior. "Mr. Cliff, I want to apologize for my attitude during our previous session," Pemberton said, as Jimmy set up his equipment for the new recordings. "I clearly didn't understand what you were creating, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to work with you again on what I now recognize is truly important music." Jimmy's response demonstrated the spiritual maturity and consciousness-raising wisdom that characterized his approach to all human relationships, including those with people who had initially failed to understand or respect his artistic mission. "Gerald, everyone's understanding grows at different rates," Jimmy replied, with obvious sincerity and forgiveness. "What matters now is that we work together to create music that serves consciousness-raising purposes and reaches people who need to hear spiritual messages about hope, determination, and social awareness." The second recording session produced even more successful material than the first, with Pemberton now approaching Jimmy's music with the respect and technical expertise that reggae consciousness deserved. The engineer who had once dismissed reggae as waste-of-time music was now dedicating himself to capturing every nuance of Jimmy's spiritual expression with the same precision he had previously reserved for rock and pop productions. The songs recorded during this session continued Jimmy's international success and further established reggae as a major force in global popular music, proving that Pemberton's initial skepticism had been based on cultural prejudice rather than accurate assessment of artistic or commercial potential. Gerald Pemberton's transformation from reggae skeptic to reggae supporter became a legend within Island Records, representing the kind of consciousness-raising conversion that Jimmy's music was creating among people who initially dismissed it as uncommercial or artistically insignificant. The story of Pemberton's complete reversal became a cautionary tale within the music industry about the dangers of judging unfamiliar musical traditions based on narrow commercial assumptions, rather than understanding their cultural significance and spiritual purpose. The success of Jimmy's music also influenced other recording engineers and music industry professionals to approach unfamiliar musical traditions with greater respect and openness, understanding that their initial judgments might be based on cultural limitations rather than accurate assessments of artistic or commercial potential. Pemberton eventually became one of reggae music's most skilled recording engineers, working with numerous Caribbean artists, including Bob Marley, Toots and the Maytals, and Burning Spear, developing technical expertise that honored reggae's unique characteristics, rather than trying to force it into inappropriate commercial formulas that compromised its spiritual and cultural authenticity. His transformation was so complete that within 2 years of Jimmy's breakthrough success, Pemberton was being specifically requested by Caribbean artists who had heard about his newfound understanding of reggae's technical requirements and spiritual purposes. Artists who had previously avoided Basing Street Studios were now eager to work with an engineer who had learned to serve consciousness-raising music. The success of Jimmy's album also created a ripple effect throughout Island Records that changed how the entire organization approached international music and cultural diversity. Chris Blackwell used Jimmy's vindication as an example of why the label needed to hire staff members who understood different musical traditions. Jimmy's success has taught us that we can't evaluate music from other cultures using our own narrow commercial assumptions, Blackwell announced during a company-wide meeting. We need to hire people who understand that different musical traditions serve different purposes and require different approaches. This policy change led to Island Records becoming the most successful label for international music, signing artists from Africa, Latin America, and Asia, who found in the company understanding that commercial success and cultural authenticity could coexist. The story of Pemberton's dismissal and subsequent conversion began spreading throughout the British music industry as other labels learned about the massive success of the album that had been initially dismissed as waste-of-time music. Record executives who had previously ignored reggae began scrambling to sign similar artists. Music journalism also began changing, as critics realized that their understanding of different musical traditions was inadequate for evaluating art that served consciousness-raising purposes. Publications began hiring writers who understood reggae's cultural context and spiritual significance. Radio programming evolved as station managers realized that audiences were hungry for music that addressed spiritual and social concerns. Progressive radio DJs began actively seeking consciousness-raising music from various cultural traditions. The impact extended beyond music into British cultural attitudes toward Caribbean communities that had been living in England for decades, but had rarely seen their cultural contributions recognized by mainstream institutions. Jimmy's vindication helped open doors for Caribbean artists, writers, filmmakers, and other creative professionals who had been marginalized by cultural institutions that hadn't understood the value of consciousness-raising art. Years later, Pemberton would regularly tell the inspiring story of his initial encounter with Jimmy Cliff as a perfect example of how cultural prejudice could prevent music industry professionals from recognizing revolutionary artistic developments that would transform popular music worldwide. I almost missed the golden opportunity to work on one of the most important albums in reggae history because I was too ignorant to understand what Jimmy was creating. Pemberton would explain to young engineers. I learned that technical skill means nothing without cultural respect. Pemberton's story became required learning for students at recording engineer schools throughout Britain, serving as a cautionary tale about approaching unfamiliar music with humility, rather than making judgments based on limited cultural understanding. The engineer who had once dismissed Jimmy's music as too simple eventually co-authored a technical manual about reggae recording techniques that became the standard reference for engineers working with Caribbean artists. Pemberton's conversion influenced his entire personal life, leading him to develop deep appreciation for Caribbean culture that extended beyond music into literature, visual arts, and spiritual practices that enhanced his understanding of consciousness-raising perspectives. He began traveling to Jamaica regularly, seeking to understand the cultural environment that had produced the music he had initially dismissed. These trips deepened his appreciation for reggae's spiritual foundations and social consciousness. Jimmy's gracious response to Pemberton's initial dismissal influenced how other artists approached skepticism within the music industry. Rather than harboring resentment, Jimmy had demonstrated consciousness-raising forgiveness that made genuine learning possible. Jimmy taught me that responding to ignorance with education, rather than anger, creates opportunities for real change, Pemberton later explained. If he had been hostile about my initial attitude, I never would have learned to appreciate what he was creating. The waste-of-time music that Pemberton had dismissed became the foundation for reggae's incredible international success, proving that consciousness-raising art could achieve both spiritual and commercial purposes when artists remained committed to their authentic vision, regardless of initial skepticism and cultural misunderstanding. If this incredible story of how dismissed waste-of-time music became international breakthrough success and completely transformed a skeptical recording engineer into a devoted reggae believer moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more amazing tales of artists who proved that authentic spiritual music can overcome any prejudice.